Hi, I'm Bob Canote, and on this episode of the Camp Chaos Chronicles, we're going to put the hard work in up front on the engine. Yeah, it's kind of stuck for an intro. Dang it. Well, this is today's pile o' parts. This has to do with getting all the parts on the front of the engine that are necessary in order to get the front cover on, which is the thing we need to do before we get the heads on. And that'll be a real milestone. So what we've got here for two engines is, first of all, the timing chain tensioner, brand new one. More on that later. The supports for the sprockets for when you got the cams separated from the cam gears. We've got our timing chain guides, the support for the tensioner, all the relevant parts here. I'm missing some of the bolts and washers and so forth. I need to get going here. And then the same thing on this side for another engine. And we got the timing chain sprocket and a spacer between the sprocket and the harmonic dampener, which also serves as a sealing surface for the crankshaft front seal. And we got two timing chains that have been soaking in oil. And I think it's important to do this. You're much more assured of getting proper lubrication of the chains on startup than to just squirt a little oil on them. The tools that we're going to use for this, well, I would normally use this one right here. This is the equivalent of the JD38 timing chain guide template that you bolt to the front of the engine and line the timing chain guides up according to. We're going to do it a little differently this time. We're going to use the heads as a means of putting the chain on so that we can check the guide placement. And then we've got this little thing right here, the JD39, which is my facsimile of the factory's unit. Somewhere several years ago, somebody published a picture on these things. What this thing does is holds the jack shaft sprocket in the proper position so that you can, when you get the timing chain and everything hooked up, the sprocket for the distributor drive is in the proper position. And in addition to that, we're going to need a dial indicator with a magnetic base and a ferrous metal plate for that to stick to, the big bolt on the end of the crankshaft to turn it over, and also our trusty crankshaft stop, which we removed from the back of the engine after we got done torquing the flex plate bolts. And let's get on it. This is the setup for the dial indicator, and then it's a simple matter of turning the crankshaft until the dial tops out. I set the needle to 0 then, and then give it a couple more trials to be sure that I've got it set correctly before I tie down the crankshaft. Then you reinstall your crankshaft lock, double check the dial indicator to make sure that nothing is moved during the course of that process. Let me just reinforce the importance of this thing, the crankshaft stop. The next operation that we're going to be performing requires that the cylinder liner retainers be removed. And if you're going to be moving the crankshaft after that, you're really running the risk of those cylinder liners popping loose. And then you got to pull everything apart and reseal everything. Just a really bad thing. The other thing that this will do for you is that once you've got top dead center located, now it's going to stay there. And once you get the engine assembled and you're going to install the distributor, you're going to time the camshafts and do a static timing on the ignition distributor. This takes all the guesswork out of it. You know where top dead center is. If you look at other YouTube channels, everybody's in a hurry, and more often than not, they're trying to start an engine. If it doesn't, the timing's off somehow, either 180 degrees out, or they, for whatever reason, the timing is an issue. So once you know where top dead center is, bang, I mean, you can get that engine started, or if it doesn't start, you know the timing isn't the issue. Now, there's some controversy as to whether the dial indicator method is the most accurate or the degree wheel. And some people argue strongly for the degree wheel. And basically what you do with this is you bolt it to the end of the crankshaft. It requires the harmonic dampener to be attached. And what this does is as it's graduated around the outside for degrees, you install a piston stop, which is what this is right here. I made this out of a piece of steel rod and a spark plug shell. And you put this in the spark plug hole and you rotate this dial till the piston tops against the piston stop. Then you mark it, rotate it back the other way until it does the same thing on the other side, top dead center. You mark that again, and whatever that midpoint is between those two marks, that's top dead center. And you also have to have some sort of an indicator. I've got this one that I made that bolts to a couple of specific water pump bolts. And this works well, it's just that it does take some time. And to be honest, I've done both on the same engine. And the difference between the two methods is about half the graduation. Not half the space between graduations, but half the graduation, the line in between degrees. So when you're that close, how do you know which one's working better for you? So I don't know. I use the dial indicator because it's a lot faster, and time is money. So now we get to put the front end of this engine together. This is where everything happens that enables the engine to run. We're going to install the guides for the timing chain. The timing chain itself, we've got a couple of stays up here that we can use to hold on to the timing gears on the camshafts when they're not actually bolted to the camshafts, and so forth. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install all the bracketry on the front of the engine, get that out of the way. And there you go. You'll notice that none of this stuff is tightened up because we're going to have to loosen, or we're going to have to adjust it eventually. And in fact, we're probably going to have to pull these two bolts in order to get the timing chain on the jack shaft sprocket. You can see we got the JT39 jack shaft wrangling tool so that the sprocket doesn't move. Make sure that the jack shaft is in the proper position for the distributor. The timing mark is up at the top, and there we go. Now this next job is just a little bit of a handful. Could actually use a third hand for this. The easy part is going to be to take the timing chain sprocket and lining it up with the keyways, slide it on. Okay, it's going to take a little bit of coercion in order to get that to move on. But you notice that there's a collar that runs underneath here. If you were to push this on all the way, you wouldn't be able to get the chain on. So before you do that, we're going to take the chain and we're going to put it on the sprocket. Just kind of hang it across the top here. And then I'm going to take a piece of aluminum and bam, there we are. Okay, so what I've done at this point, put the sprocket on. By the way, the sprocket can go either way. Although what I do is I make a mark on here with a paint pen so I know which side was out, because the chain and that sprocket can develop wear patterns together, so I think it's probably a good idea. And install the chain. Then I put the heads on the engine and installed the sprockets up here, but installed them loose, didn't put any bolts in them. And both sides, I've got the tensioner in there, but I haven't unlatched it. There's really no need to do this. And I take this side, pull it tight, and being that the crankshaft is locked, nothing's going to move, and you can see that I've adjusted the guide so that the chain falls flat upon it. And then, so the chain is tight up to there. Then I take this one, pull this one tight, and take the lock off of the jack shaft so that it can move a little as necessary. And I've adjusted the sprocket, the chain guide in the same way, make sure it runs straight. And the same thing on this side over here, although you really can't see it. In addition to the chain guides being lined up properly, what you want to do is take the sprocket supports, and they will move back and forth about a ½ inch either way, and position those so that the pin on the end of the timing gear hub is lined up at the middle of that on both sides when you lock the guide bolts down as well. Not super critical, it's just really helpful when you're trying to pull these camshafts off for whatever reason later on, that these guides be where they need to be. Before I take the heads off, what I've done is I've marked with a paint pen where the jack shaft and the chain lie on each other there, so that later on when I put the heads on in the final assembly, that everything is timed together properly. Nothing to move down here. You can see that that chain is captured on that sprocket, so it's where it's going to be. The only thing I want to be concerned about is right here. As I said, I took the J39, I think is the number, guide off of here, or lock for the jack shaft off, and you can see that the timing mark is pointed straight up. And I believe that's there so that we can be assured that the distributor gear in the back of the jack shaft is in the proper position for the distributor to sit properly on the engine. We've got to pull these heads off and do the same thing to engine number 2. Now, putting the valley cover on is a pretty straightforward thing. Of course, you got your gasket. I put high Lamar on both sides of the gaskets to make sure that it's sealed, and it goes on like that. And you just need to bolt the thing on. One thing you want to remember is that the rear air conditioning mount goes on like this. You're probably going to have to move it back and forth a little bit in order to get it to match up with the back of the compressor, but that needs to go in there. These bolts right here, what they are is flathead, Phillips head machine screws. And if I've got a good quality one, I'll reuse it. But what I normally do is I go to the hardware store and I pick up a flathead Allen head. Pretty easy. Not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I will say one thing regarding gaskets. Okay, that's a good gasket. And this fits very neatly on the top of the engine valley, and all the holes line up. Now, what happens sometimes with these gaskets, and they could even be from the same manufacturer, you will find that they line up on one end, but they're short on this end. This particular one is about a ½ inch short. And what are you going to do? And sometimes it's the same thing on the front cover gaskets as well. What are you going to do? Well, you put the set back together and you send it back to the person that sold it from you, explain the situation, and hopefully they see things your way and send you another set that they can use this gasket to match up with the one they're going to send you this time, and make sure that it actually fits. I don't know if this stuff shrinks over time as it gets older and dries out, or what the situation is. But what I've done, instead of messing with that, because when they come in, they're about a third of the time they're like this. And so I've got a roll of gasket material of the same type that I'll actually use the valley cover as a template and actually cut my own, because it's, you're wasting so much time just sending stuff back and having them send you new stuff. So anyway, going to button this up and then going to put the front cover on. Doing a final inspection on the front cover of this engine. And got some stuff here that I'm a little concerned about. I don't know how well you can see that, but what we've got here is a divot that's been forced into this flange somehow. I don't even know if you can see yeah, you can see that it's pretty deep. I don't know how that happens, but it happened. Same thing here. you can see that. Now how I find this stuff is I take a precision file and I go over the edge like this, and making absolutely certain that I keep it flat. And what I found here was you got this contact surface through the middle here, and it's really been deformed out here. I don't know. I think I'm gonna have to go to the shed and find another front cover, because that's pretty bad. The other thing I could do is take some JB Weld, which is sort of the miracle drug for just about everything that goes wrong, and lay a film in here. Around this hole too, there's some corrosion that's caused some pitting. I mean, the probability of a leak through this area, as far as I'm seeing, is really pretty strong at this point. I could just slather it up with RTV and hope for the best, but you don't want a customer's engine to start leaking within the first 500 miles that they drive it. Getting ready to put the front cover on, double checking everything, putting a wrench, every nut and bolt underneath here, because they're all kind of important. And also checking all of the edges, the machined edges, because a lot of times when these blocks and castings get handled, they get banged around a little bit, particularly by the people that are doing machine work for you, or cleaning up parts and that sort of thing. So it's really important that any burrs on these edges all the way around here are filed off, because they can hold the parts away from the part that they're supposed to be firmly up against. So there's that. You also notice that I've got the gaskets on there with a little bit of blue Hylamar holding them in place. It's so much easier to do this with them stuck down than it is just having them flopping free. You can see that we've got the spacer that is in between the timing chain drive gear and the damper, which fits out here. What I do is I flip this thing around so that the new seal in the front case, front cover, has a fresh surface to run against, assuming it's not pitted, because the engine's been sitting in a junkyard for 20 years. And what else? Oh yeah, make sure that the timing chain is in the latched position. I'm going to be doing a short video on timing chain tensioners sometime in the near future. And you can see that I've got the cover. I've got a thin film of Hylamar all the way around, and the gasket surfaces. Really important thing, and it's easily forgotten, is to put the seal in here. This is part of the casting on an E-type there, where a hole actually goes through and runs to the oil filter, I believe it is, if I remember correctly. So the way you know you got the right one is that you can kind of run your finger over it and it sticks up above this surface. So that's really important. The new seal is installed here. That's just a matter of simply tapping it in all the way around with I use a plastic hammer on it until it's fully seated on the back side. Another point, be sure you put a coating of oil on this surface that the seal runs against, as well as on the seal itself, before you put the front cover on. Front cover installation is complete. When you're doing it, be sure you include the things that need to go under the bolts, like this is the mount for the tensioner, the alternator. This doesn't have to be. This is the air pump mount, as well as the alternator mount itself right here. That doesn't need to be on here, but this really does, because there's a number of bolts. I think there's 5 bolts that attach it to the front cover, and some of which go all the way to the block. And I think it's important to have this bolted on there so that it draws the front cover to the block, so that when you put the head on, that everything's in the proper relationship to each other. It could be that once you bolt the head on, this joint right here between the front cover and the block may not be pulled up tight. So it's best to pull it up tight first, then put the head on.